There is a street in Germany where, for over 700 years, no one has played music. No drums, no dancing, not even at weddings, not even now. The street is called Bungalowsenstrasse, the street without drums, and it sits in a small town called Hamelin. Ask a local why, and they'll tell you it's because of the children, not a fairy tale. The actual children of this actual town, who actually disappeared on a date Hamelin still knows down to the day, June 26, 1284. There were no rats in the original story. There was no flute-shaped revenge plot, no unpaid invoice, no villain to blame. Someone, or something, took 130 children out of this town and they never came back. And Hamelin has spent the 7 centuries since, too afraid to let music return to the one street they were last seen walking down. Strip away everything Disney and the Brothers Grimm gave you, and what's left is a town's own paperwork. And it's worse than the fairy tale. Around the year 1300, within a single generation of the event, Hamelin's market church installed a stained glass window showing a piper in bright, mismatched clothing leading a procession of children away. That window survived for over 300 years before it was destroyed in 1660, but written descriptions of it exist from before its destruction, and none of them mention a single rat. 100 years after the event, in 1384, the town's own chronicle contains one of the bleakest lines in medieval record, "Keeping anywhere. It is 100 years since our children left. Not died, not were taken. 2. Lefty." As if the town still hadn't found better language for what happened, a full century on, for generations afterward, Hamelin dated its official documents by how many years had passed since the children's disappearance, the way other towns counted years since a war or a coronation. Civic memorials were carved into the town's own buildings. One gate, built in 1556, declares it was erected 272 years after the magician led 130 children out of the town. You don't build a tradition like that, generation after generation, around something that didn't happen. Here's the part that should unsettle you more than the fairy tale ever did. The version with rats doesn't appear anywhere in the historical record until the middle of the 16th century, roughly 250 years after the actual event. The earliest surviving written account, a manuscript from the nearby town of Lüneburg dated to around 1440, describes a piper in multicolored clothing leading 30 children to a hill called the Koppen, where they were lost. No vermin. No infestation, no revenge plot. For a story that survived this long, specifically because of its rats, that's a strange detail to be missing from every account written closer to the actual day. Someone added them later. Most likely because a story about a town's children simply vanishing, with no explanation and no resolution, was too raw to tell straight to the next generation. A plague of rats gave the story a villain who deserved what came to him, and a debt that explained the unexplainable. The original story doesn't have a villain. It just has an empty street and a number, 130. For the greater part of a century, historians have been attempting to explain what truly transpired on the Koppen in 1284, and the majority of the obvious explanations fall apart as soon as you look at a calendar. Everyone looks for the Black Death first, but it didn't arrive in Europe until 1347. Which is more than 60 years too late to be the cause. Similar to the mass hysteria that would later destroy Strasbourg in 1508, dancing plagues have also been proposed. In the 13th century, there were documented outbreaks of compulsive, exhausting dancing near Hamelin, which were occasionally connected to ergot poisoning from contaminated rye. The picture of kids marching toward a hilltop eerily fits the pattern. But the theory most historians now treat as the strongest explanation is colder than either of those, because it doesn't require a disaster at all. It requires a sales pitch. The 13th century was the height of the Ostsiedlung, a mass German eastward migration into territory that had just opened up for settlement following the defeat of Danish forces in 1227. Land in Pomerania, Brandenburg, and further east needed people, and local nobles paid professional recruiters, called locators, to go out and find them. Locators were known for wearing bright, multicolored clothing to stand out in a crowd, and for using music to draw townspeople together before making their pitch, leave the overcrowded towns of Westphalia and Lower Saxony, where inheritance laws left younger sons with nothing, and become a landowner instead, on territory that was yours simply for showing up and working it. A linguist named Jürgen Udolph has spent years tracing Hamelin surnames forward in time. They keep turning up hundreds of kilometers east, in villages founded during that same window, carrying place names that mirror towns back home. One village near Berlin is even called Hamelspring, an echo of Hamelspringe, right outside Hamelin itself. If this theory holds, the Pied Piper wasn't a murderer, and he wasn't a sorcerer. He was a recruiter doing his job well, and the children he led away were very likely young adults. Medieval records routinely used the word children to mean a town's dependents, its young people, regardless of actual age. They didn't vanish into a mountain. They walked east, toward land that had just become available, following a stranger's promise of a better life than the one waiting for them at home. And the town they left behind never heard from them again. Not because anything sinister happened to them on the road, but because medieval correspondence across that kind of distance was nearly impossible. And the people who'd left had little reason, and even less means, to write home. That's the version that should disturb you more than any fantasy ending ever could. Not a child-eating cave, not a vengeful piper collecting on a debt, but the far more mundane horror of 130 young people walking out of the only town they'd ever known, swallowed not by magic, but by distance and silence, while the families left behind had no way of knowing if they'd arrived safely, started new lives, or died somewhere on the road and simply never made it. No closure, no letter, no confirmation, ever. Even later retellings seem to flinch from how absolute that silence was. Most versions of the legend include one or two children left behind, too lame or too deaf or too blind to keep up with the rest, as if the story needed at least one witness to survive and tell it. The real record has no survivors. It has an empty street and a number the town never stopped counting from. Regardless of what actually transpired on the Koppen that June, it was so terrible that the entire town reconstructed its calendar around the loss, etched memorial inscriptions into its own walls for centuries to come, and silently decided, generation after generation, to never again play music on the road their children left on. Even now, Hamelin continues to honor that commitment. You won't hear a single note if you stand on Bungelosenstrasse in 2026. After 702 years, there has been no break in the stillness. If a town can carry a wound for 700 years without ever knowing what actually caused it, imagine what gets buried in a single human lifetime. Subscribe if you want more of these. The history that survived as a fairy tale because the truth was too heavy to tell straight. And if you want a story where the cover-up wasn't an accident of memory but a deliberate one, go watch the episode on the Bloody Benders, a family that vanished from their own crime scene days before anyone came looking and was never conclusively found.